Our study is in 1 Corinthians 15. These are not lectures to the Society of Biblical Literature or the Society of New Testament Scholars. They're meant to be to pastors and interested people. And I would like thus to read the portion that we'll be looking at tonight in 1 Corinthians 15, beginning at verse 35 and going through verse 52. But someone may ask, how are the dead raised? With what kind of body will they come? How foolish! What you sow does not come to life unless it dies. When you sow, you do not plant the body that will be, but just a seed, perhaps of wheat or of something else. But God gives it a body as He has determined, and to each kind of seed He gives His own body. All flesh is not the same. Men have one kind of flesh, animals have another, birds another, and fish another. There are also heavenly bodies, and there are earthly bodies. But the splendor of the heavenly bodies is one kind, and the splendor of the earthly bodies is another. The sun has one kind of splendor, the moon another, and the stars another, and stars differ from star, and a star differs from star in splendor. So it will be with the resurrection of the dead. The body that is sown is perishable, it is raised imperishable. It is sown in dishonor, it is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness, it is raised in power. It is sown a natural body, it is raised a spiritual body. If there is a natural body, there is also a spiritual body. So it is written, the first man, Adam, became a living being, the last Adam, a life-giving spirit. The spiritual did not come first, but the natural, and after that the spiritual. The first man was of the dust of the earth, the second man from heaven. As was the earthly man, so are those who are of the earth, and as is the man from heaven, so are also those who are of heaven. And just as we have borne the likeness of the earthly man, so we must bear the likeness of the man from heaven. I declare to you, brothers, that flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, nor does the perishable inherit the imperishable. Listen, I tell you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed. In a flash, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trump. For the trumpet will sound, the dead will be raised imperishable, and we shall be changed. The thought of believers at Corinth was not only that resurrection was irrelevant, and thus Paul has to argue for the thatness of the resurrection, but also evidently that it was impossible. And so Paul has to here argue for the possibility. How are the dead raised? With what kind of body will they come? Perhaps the expression flesh and blood in verse 50, that is something we must talk about as we move down in the lecture, was a watchword of the Corinthians themselves, as some have suggested. And thus, flesh and blood shall not inherit the kingdom of God. But be that as it may, probably they thought of divine salvation as something for the soul alone, as in Greek religious philosophy, probably because they believed that personality resided in the soul alone. And since the soul is inherently immortal in their view, there's no need for any further action in resurrection. Or perhaps probably because they interpreted resurrection only in spiritual terms, so equating it with their conversion and seeing it as already something that has taken place. This seems to be part of the problem that is referred to in 2 Timothy 2:18, referring to Hymenaeus and Philetus at Ephesus, who it is said have erred concerning the truth, saying that the resurrection is past, and have overthrown some of the faith. They certainly didn't believe that the resurrection is past and they missed it. They believed it was past in their spiritual experience. Possibly, I'm suggesting, also the people at Corinth rejected the possibility of a resurrection because of various crude and crass Jewish views of resurrection, which primarily thought of resurrection in terms of reanimation or resuscitation, when indeed it did think of resurrection. And some of those I want to get into tonight. To these confused converts, Paul answers in the last verse that we read tonight, I tell you a mystery, that which is enigmatic, but now I want to clarify, and my whole thesis is on the basis of now Christ's resurrection. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed. The dead will be raised imperishable, incorruptible, and shall be changed. And so the emphasis here tonight on changed. Tomorrow night I'd like to talk something about sleep, but tonight about changed. In the Greek religious world, of course, and to give some background, as we've already seen, the body played no part in a person's salvation. And so, as we've said, the pun, soma sema, the body is a tomb. Paul would never say that. Paul says, soma neos, the body is a temple. But, or a skenos, the body is a tabernacle. But they would talk in terms of the body is a tomb. Souls are immortal, pre-existent, fully knowledgeable, entrapped in the material aspects of life at birth, and only released at death. And so the physical at best is only neutral. The Stoics, for instance, attempted to learn how to live within the physical and not allow it to affect too much the spiritual, though, as Epictetus tells us, one of the great Stoics of the first century, if one cannot find life in the physical satisfying and one is oppressed by it, there is always, quote, the tolling bell, the route of suicide that allows one to get out of it, though that was the last recourse. At best, neutral. At worst, well, it was decidedly harmful. Philo, for instance, could say that it is only the withered and the wasted who really can be those who are thoughtful and thinkers, which rules, indeed, me and a number of other of us out entirely. But we must learn how to cause that physical to wither and waste away. Salvation, therefore, is now in the Greek world for the soul alone, and in the future also for the soul alone. And so, as reflected in Paul's ministry in Athens in Acts 17:32, when they heard of the resurrection, some mocked. This is very strange. But what I would like to do tonight is to take you a little more into Jewish thought, what has been called Second Temple Judaism. If you don't know that word, intertestamental Judaism, though the Jew would never explain it that way. Late Judaism, though that sounds like Judaism has ceased. The Jewish world would prefer early Judaism or formative Judaism, but probably Second Temple Judaism is the most neutral term one can find. Roughly the period from about 200 BC or a little before to roughly about AD 100 or 200 BCE to 100 CE. And to suggest, to point out here that in this time there is no single or unified view regarding death or life after death. Rather, there are a multiplicity of differing beliefs. There are two dominant views that seem to emerge: resurrection of the whole person, but that has a number of variations in it, or the immortality of the soul, but again, that seems to have some variations within it. In some of this literature, some of you are going to be familiar with, and some are not going to be familiar at all. I hope you're sitting next to somebody who knows this literature very well, and you can just punch them and say, "What's that?" and they tell you. But nonetheless, believe me that these names I'm going to be saying are really there and are significant. Taking some of this literature, let me just lay out a number of motifs, and any attempt to catalog is something that is a bit fabricated, because you're trying to take a vast amount of material and group it and there are always loose edges, or rough edges, I should say, but nonetheless, with a large brush, paint the picture here. Many passages in this material simply end with people falling asleep, which is the common expression both in the New Testament and in the intertestamental materials for death. Or with the expression being gathered to his fathers. In many cases, that is characterized as being eternal, as in the testament of Issachar, the testament of Dan, or beautiful, or peaceful. So, for instance, the book of Jubilees, which is attempting to go through the patriarchal period of Genesis and up through Exodus 20. It's not apocalypse as such, but it contains rather an organization of all of the great patriarchs into 49-year periods and then 7 sevens. And it's really arguing in a sectarian way that indeed if God has been so careful to organize all of life in this way, we ought to be very careful to organize our festivals and our religious service in a proper way. And it's really arguing for the solar the solar calendar, and other things. It has a great deal of ethics to it. It has chapter 23 that's an apocalypse. But many of the patriarchs, as it talks about them, sleep eternally, peacefully, beautifully, gathered to their fathers. And there's no further discussion. Likewise, in the testaments of the 12 patriarchs, which appears in Aramaic version for Levi and Hebrew version for Naphtali, but what we have is all Greek, and probably a little later, but nonetheless throughout there, which is primarily given to ethical statements of what each of the 12 patriarchs said on his deathbed. Nonetheless, again, many of them die, and that's it. There's no further discussion. However, there are other passages in this material that speak of those who have lived in intimate relationship with God, that is, the righteous, continuing to live in that relationship even after death. I suggested the possibility of so reading some of the Psalms that way last night. I won't go back into those Psalms, but you find a number of such statements that have to do with this continuing relationship after death. It's not spelled out to any great extent, though oftentimes astral imagery is used. That is, oftentimes they are in the heavens, they shine as the stars, and this kind of imagery is used. For instance, and I just take for instance, in 1st Enoch, which is 108 chapters in the Ethiopic Enoch, which has been found now except for the second book at Qumran, you get a number of statements in regard to continued intimacy, but without spelling out exactly what all that means. 1st Enoch, for instance, 102, in Book 5, the latter part of 1st Enoch, "You souls of the righteous, fear not, and be hopeful. You souls that died in righteousness, be not sad because your souls have gone down to Sheol in sorrow, or because your flesh fared not well, the earthly existence in accordance with your goodness. Souls, fear not, be hopeful." You begin here talking about the division of physical and inward, but nonetheless, be hopeful. Or again in chapter 103, verses 3 and 4, "For all good things and joy and honor prepared for and written down for the souls of those who died in righteousness. Many and good things shall be given to you, the offshoot of your labors. Your lot exceeds even that of the living ones. The spirits of those who have died in righteousness shall live and rejoice. Their spirits shall not perish, nor their memorial from before the face of the Great One, until all the generations of the whole earth." Again, even live in a relationship better than the ones who are living physically. Or again in chapter 104, "Be hopeful, because formerly you have pined away through evil and toil, but now you shall shine like lights of heaven. And you shall be seen, and the windows of heaven shall be opened for you, and you will have great joy as the angels in heaven." You remember Jesus talking to the Sadducees. He said, they will neither marry nor be given marriage, but it will be like the angels in heaven. That theme is very dominant in 2 Temple Judaism. Or again in chapter 108, the last chapter, seems to be an added-on chapter, and I won't debate exactly its source, but nonetheless it was there very early, however, never added on, makes this point. I shall bring them, that is the righteous, out into the bright light, those who have loved my holy name, and seat them each one upon the throne of his honor. And they shall be resplendent for ages that cannot be numbered. The righteous one shall be resplendent. And it goes on in ways that are very astral in imagery. Probably that astral image being picked up from Daniel chapter 12, where the righteous are promised to shine like the brightness of the heavens. And that theme is carried on much of this literature. In fact, if I quote every passage where that appears, we would take at least the next hour just to quote those passages. I'm just giving you a thumbnail sketch. So you get that astral imagery in Second Temple texts, so you get it in Jesus, and so you get it carried on in the rabbinic materials, the Talmud, that the righteous ones shall be in heaven and shine as stars and be like stars. That's exceedingly common. It isn't saying too much about immortality or resurrection. It isn't trying to go beyond that. It's using poetic language to speak in regard to there will be a continued relationship of the righteous with God. But there is a growing emphasis on the resurrection of the person in this material. And it's with this and also with the growing emphasis on immortality that I want to deal and focus especially tonight, and then go on to say what Paul is saying in regard to all of that. And let me quote a number of passages, though again, while they might seem voluminous, they are just representative. There's much more that could be picked out. In First Enoch, for instance, there is what is called the Book of the Similitudes, or the Parables of Enoch, chapters 37 to 71. I start with this, though perhaps should not, because we really don't know quite where to date this. Some have argued that it might very well be Christian material. It wasn't found at Qumran. I suppose I start with this rather to get it out of the way, so at least I mention it someplace. I don't know quite where to fit it in if I'm doing some kind of development in this, but nonetheless, in the Book of the Similitudes of Enoch, we have many statements that talk in terms of something that sounds like resurrection. I quote from chapter 51, verses 1 to 5. In those days the earth will give back all that has been entrusted to it, and Sheol will return all the deposits which she has received, and hell will give back all that it owes. I take it those are three synonymous expressions generally, the earth, Sheol, and hell. And I'm not going to try to make any great distinctions between those three right now. I think that's poetic parallelism there. And God shall choose the righteous and the holy ones from among the risen dead. And it goes on to speak in poetic expression. I won't read all that. In fact, for your sake, I'm going to not read any more in First Enoch 37 to 71, simply because all that I say you don't know quite where to place. But there is imagery there. In 2 Maccabees, we have some very graphic imagery that certainly talks about resurrection in both, if we can make the statements, soul and bodily form. In fact, there's a great emphasis given to the body in 2 Maccabees. Now, 2 Maccabees is indeed something that glorifies the Hashmoneans, whose ideological descendants were the Sadducees. And the Sadducees deny the resurrection, we learn in the New Testament. But that seems to have been something that they developed later. 2 Maccabees, 1st, 2nd Maccabees are the story of the Maccabean revolt against the Seleucids. It's not that you go so far in 1st Maccabees and then so far in 2nd Maccabees. It's rather you go the whole gamut of Judah's rebellion in 1st Maccabees and then retell it in 2nd Maccabees with emphasis on the supernatural. 3rd Maccabees is about Ptolemy Philadelphus and about something in Egypt, and 4th Maccabees is a treatment of a philosophic tractate that uses the examples from the Maccabean period. The interesting thing is none of this material was found at Qumran. The pietistic group at Qumran reacted strongly to some of the glorification of the Hashmoneans. None of this material is referred to in the Talmud. The Pharisees reacted strongly to anything the Sadducees had. But we do have this material that's carried on and was read widely, used extensively by Josephus when he wrote the Antiquities of the Jews. In this period, he follows First and somewhat Second Maccabees, almost literally. And Second Maccabees, though perhaps material that later was accepted by the Sadducees, nonetheless has some physical resurrection materials here. It contains a number of martyr stories in which the belief of the resurrection after death serves as a source of encouragement to those who are being tortured on account of their refusal to transgress the law of God. Let me just refer to a few that are obvious. The mother with her 7 sons. Each of the sons slowly, gruesomely tortured, with limbs being slowly ripped off and called to recant, but not one of them does. And then the mother encourages the sons to go on. And you get these awful depictions. In the case of the 4th son, he says nobly, I got these as his tongue is being pulled out. Just before it, of course, is pulled out. He says, I got these from heaven, and because of his laws I disdain them, and from him I hope to get them back again. His tongue and other members just before he is dismembered. So the 4th brother says, I hope to get all these back. And again, quoting him, one cannot but choose to die at the hands of men and to cherish the hope that God gives of being raised again by him. But for you, there will be no resurrection to life. Second Maccabees talks about physical resurrection of the righteous, but not resurrection of the unrighteous. And while her sons are being gruesomely tortured, the mother encourages them not to give in and to transgress the law of God. And you have a little soliloquy given here by the mother. I do not know how you came into being in my womb. It was not I who gave you life and breath, nor was I the one who set the elements within each of you. It was the Creator of the world who shaped each of you within me. And so, in his mercy, he gives life and breath, and he'll give it back to you again, since you now forget yourselves for the sake of his law. And she urges them to go on. He will give you back all of that again. And the 7th brother, as he is killed, says, my brothers have now fallen in loyalty to God's covenant after brief pain leading to eternal life. There's another martyr story there in regard to Raziz, an elder of Jerusalem who commits suicide rather than transgress the law of God. And the gruesome story concludes as follows. Still alive and aflame with anger, he rose, and though his blood gushed forth and wounds were severe, he ran through the crowd, and standing upon a steep rock, with his blood now completely drained from him, he tore out his entrails and took them with both hands, hurled them at the crowd, calling upon the Lord of life and spirit to give them back to him again at the resurrection. A gruesome story, but hoping and looking forward to that time of resurrection. There's another passage in 2 Maccabees where Judah, or Judas, the leader of the rebellion, in chapter 12, verses 43 to 45, goes throughout the slain, and he's surprised to find that amongst the slain there are not only Syrian soldiers or Seleucids, but there are also Jewish soldiers, and he can't understand why God allowed the Jewish soldiers to die. But as he goes to bury them, he finds that they are wearing pagan amulets around their necks. And he then understands how they came about to die, because they were really trying to, as it were, play both ends against the middle, and they were wearing these pagan amulets. But he nonetheless collects all of them and buries them apart from the pagan symbols. And it is said this, in doing this, he acted very well and honorably, taking account of the resurrection. For if they were not expecting that those who had fallen would rise again, it would have been superfluous and foolish to pray for the dead. Here's one of the passages that Martin Luther had some problems with, and this is not canonical material, and Luther said, recognize once and for all it's not. But Judah did pray for the dead, prayed for his Jewish comrades who died, even though they were wearing pagan symbols. But if he was looking to the splendid reward that is laid up for those who fall asleep in godliness, it was a holy and pious thought. Therefore he made atonement for the dead, that they might be delivered from their sin. Judah, the great hero, is depicted as one who believes in the resurrection of the dead. 2 Maccabees. You get that as well in other writings. I'm just going to tell you other writings. 4th Ezra particularly, though it's rather in a confused state, or at least confused to us to try to understand it all. 4th Ezra is written sometime around AD 100. It's a writing that is trying to explain, it's a theodicy, trying to explain why the fall of Jerusalem in the fall to Titus, and Vespasian and then Titus, the two generals. But in that account in chapter 7, it has one of the most intriguing passages that has given light to a basis for all sorts of interesting developments. In the Middle Ages, there was this man, Sabati Sevi, who picked up some of this material and tried to develop it, even claimed he was Messiah. But it's a very difficult passage. But let me just read it to you in 4th Ezra, chapter 7, verses 29 to 31. At that time the earth shall give up those who are asleep in it, and the chamber shall give up the souls that have been committed to them, and the Most High shall be revealed upon the seat of judgment, and compassion shall pass away, and patience be withdrawn, but judgment alone shall remain, and truth shall stand, and faithfulness shall grow. Well, I don't have the passage I was going to read to you. It talks in terms of there will be a period of darkness, but it does talk in terms of resurrection. I think I'm going to leave most of that at 4th Ezra. You can find all sorts of passages. Likewise, I'm going to leave that of 2nd Baruch, if you don't mind. I don't think you're going to be too bothered there. There is one writing, so-called Sibylline oracles, the so-called Sibyl from Greece, though it is Jewish diaspora writing. In Book 4 of the Sibylline oracles, you get a periodization of history leading up to the time of resurrection and final judgment, two great eschatological events. At that time, reading from the Sibylline oracles 176 to 191, Book 4, 176 to 191, God will burn the whole earth and will destroy the whole race of men and all cities and rivers at once in the sea. He will destroy everything by fire, and so on. It talks about all his terrible judgments. God himself will again fashion the bones and ashes of men, and he will raise up mortals again as they were before. And there will be judgment over which God will preside, judging the world again. As many as sin by impiety, these will a mound of earth cover, and they will be punished and not. But for those who are the righteous, he will raise them up as they were before. And the description is here in terms of almost reanimation. Yet on the other hand, and some of you who know this literature are going to say, oh, that's a terrible, sketchy treatment. On the other hand, others will say, I'm glad he's getting done with that. Still, there is that emphasis on resurrection that I would like to suggest is largely given over to reanimation and resuscitation, 2 Maccabees and the Sibylline Oracles, Book 4 particularly. But there's also a growing emphasis on the immortality of the soul apart from anything physical. In Jubilees, which, as I said, is organizing all of patriarchal history from Genesis 1 to Exodus 20, in terms of various Jubilees of 49 years each, and then 7 sevens with each of those. There is the apocalypse of chapter 23 that tells about the future, and in that it talks about the Lord will heal his servants, They will rise up and see great peace. They will drive out their enemies, and the righteous one will see and give peace and rejoice forever and ever with joy. And that might only refer to the nation. But then it goes on, and their bones will rest in the earth, and their spirits will increase joy, and they will know that the Lord is an executor of judgment. But he will show mercy to hundreds and thousands, to all who love him. Their bones will rest in the earth, but their spirits will increase joy. That's written sometime, perhaps as early as the 3rd century BC. It's a hint. It's not a fully developed immortality doctrine. In Wisdom of Solomon, however, which is a piece of wisdom literature, as it's called, Wisdom of Solomon, with ethical advice, something very similar to the Proverbs or Sirach or Jesus ben Sirach in its ethical emphases, a distilling of all the prophetic message and applying it ethically to the times here and now. We have a somewhat cloudy and confused picture of eschatological views, yet through it all there shines this doctrine of immortality in clarifying the ambiguities. And this is a portion where immortality is very strong. In fact, it opens in chapter 1, verse 15, with the statement, "For righteousness is immortal." And of course argues as you go through that all who are associated with righteousness are immortal. Now, in context, while it talks about immortality, may I suggest that it appears that the immortality is not necessarily an inherent quality of the person, innately so, but the immortality is something that is given. But it's an immortality apart from anything physical. It is an immortality not inherent, but given as a reward of righteousness, but still nothing physical. The situation of the ungodly is to go into Hades. There's no return from death. But the situation for the righteous is described in this way: the souls of the righteous are in the hand of God, and no torment will ever touch them. In the eyes of the foolish, they seem to have died, and their departure was thought to be an affliction, and their going from us to be their destruction. But they are at peace. For though in the sight of men they were punished, their hope is full of immortality. In the time of their visitation they will shine forth and will run like sparks through the stubble. They will govern nations and rule over peoples, and the Lord will reign over them forever. The righteous seem to have died, but in reality their souls continue to exist, and they continue to exist because they are awarded for their righteousness immortality. So they are in a much better place. They will be in the hand of God at peace, and thus their immortality will be fulfilled. Now, yet there are statements in Wisdom of Solomon that make it sound as though that immortality is not only awarded, but might also be inherent, though these are the more minor statements, but I must read them. For instance, in chapter 8, verses 19 and 20, "As a child by nature I was well endowed, and a good soul fell to my lot. Or rather, being good, I entered an undefiled body." Now that sounds Greek. If you didn't have that statement, you could have said, as I said earlier, that it's just immortality awarded. But a good soul fell to my lot. Or rather, being good, I entered an undefiled body. Chapter 8, verses 19 and 20. Or again in chapter 9, verse 15. "For a perishable body weighs down the soul, and this earthly tent burdens the thoughtful." Philo could have said that. And this might very well be reflecting that kind of Hellenistic Judaism. it sounds very much like a Platonic understanding of the pre-existence of the soul. But you can also find many other statements where immortality is awarded. I suggest that you have, even in this one writing, a conflicting understanding. Maybe our categories are not broad enough to include it all, but it seems hard to include what sounds very Platonic with something that is then awarded. Or another passage, another book that tells us very much about immortality is that of 4th Maccabees. 4th Maccabees is really a philosophic tractate written perhaps at the end of the 1st century A.D. or C.E. It's attempting to show that pious reason enables one to master the emotions. And thus you get a number of passages on mastering the emotions through pious reason. In order to demonstrate the truth of this proposition, the author uses the martyrdoms expressed in 2nd Maccabees, for there are noble examples of piety mastering the emotions. However, 4th Maccabees, whereas 2nd Maccabees talks about resurrection in very literal reanimation terms, 4th Maccabees replaces these statements with expressions of immortality and seems to do it quite consciously in opposition to what 2nd Maccabees has. Thus, for instance, after the martyrdom of Eleazar, the author of 4th Maccabees says, "Only those who with all their heart make piety their first concern are able to conquer the passions of the flesh, believing that to God they do not die, understanding that they cannot be affected by death." They are in that sense like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who continue to live. Or again, the author makes a similar statement after he talks about the 7 brothers who die in martyrdom. "They knew full well themselves that those who die for the sake of God live unto God." And their death is then described as something that really is only something of an appearance. Here in 4th Maccabees, the martyrs die and pass directly into immortality and communion with God. Whereas in 2nd Maccabees, they die and await a time when God will come and resurrect them. And there is that difference. Now, there could be more quoted, and I'm not going to try to quote more. No, I'm not even going to try. There are good examples, and you can keep picking them out. But may I just say that what comes to be fairly dominant is resurrection, but with unclear views, or immortality, though with some variety of opinion. And if we went through, say, Psalms of Solomon, you'd see a lot of these things mixed. If you went to the Dead Sea Scrolls, you wouldn't find either resurrection or immortality, which is concerned some. And you wonder exactly why. But it seems the Dead Sea Covenanters were not really interested in facing death. What they were interested in is the fulfillment and the consummation of all the promises of God in their lifetime. And so they weren't struggling with the question of death and life after death. If you read Josephus, he talks about resurrection and says that the Pharisees believed in resurrection. But then as he defines resurrection, talks about how souls are immortal and how they are caught up into the heavens at death and then reimplanted in new bodies, which sounds like reincarnation. And you begin to say, my, Josephus, what kind of a doctrine of resurrection do you have? And of course, if you read Philo, who despises and disparages everything physical, you get a very strong emphasis on immortality. Jesus, as I mentioned in Mark chapter 12, verse 25, as he's talking to the Sadducees, says to them, you do err, you don't know the power of God, and in heaven you don't realize that there's neither marriage nor giving in marriage, but they are like the angels in heaven, with that astral imagery, but that's pretty much what many Jews have been saying. The disciples, as they come down from the Mount of Transfiguration, I think there's a revealing little glimpse here in Mark chapter 9, and it is Mark that tells us this. They come down from the Mount of Transfiguration. They kept the matter apart, and Jesus told them that you should not tell anyone what they had seen until the Son of Man is risen from the dead. And Mark adds, they kept the matter to themselves, discussing what the rising of the dead meant. There's a little article there, and some have said, well, of course, the article means what Jesus' resurrection from the dead meant. But I think they were coming down and shaking their heads as Galilean fishermen and saying there's so much discussion on the question of resurrection. What in the world does he mean by the resurrection? And I think that little phrase in Mark 9:10 is pretty much the epitome of the normal Jewish reaction to this whole matter. Maybe the schools of the Pharisees had certain fixed ideas. Maybe some of those writing tractates had certain fixed ideas, and maybe their argument going on, but most of the populace is standing by and saying, what in the world does resurrection mean? I don't understand that. In this whole context, and I'm sorry to take all the time on the context, but nonetheless, I want to impress on you, because oftentimes it's assumed that Pharisees believed in resurrection, period, with the understanding just as we do, or as I do, or you do, and Sadducees didn't believe, or others didn't believe, and you leave it there, or Greeks didn't believe, and you leave it there. I think while I like Oscar Coleman in many ways, and while I like the point of his book on resurrection or immortality, yet he tends to set it up that all Jews believed in resurrection and all Greeks believed in immortality, period. And that just isn't the case, so that I must oppose that. But in Paul's day, there was a great welter of confusion and confusing views as to what indeed is death and what indeed is life after death. Precious in the sight of the Lord the death of one of his saints, indeed, as we've seen earlier. But what does that mean in particular? And now Paul, writing to these people who also have this problem, though from a Greek perspective, say, and Paul repeats their question, how are the dead raised? With what kind of body will they come? I take it that's really just one question phrased in parallel fashion. So I'm not going to have to deal with two questions here, but one. Isn't that I'm just trying to make it simple for myself? I suggest that that is a nice parallel phraseology. And Paul answers and says, how foolish. Let me give you two illustrations. And he gives the illustration of the grain. He says it dies. I think that's phenomenological language. Quite literally, I trust the germ does not die or there would be no life. But as far as one can look on phenomenologically, there is decay going on. But he says that what you plant indeed doesn't just pop up in the same form. There's continuity presupposed in all that, but it comes up in a different form. How foolish, he says. Don't you understand that we're not just talking here about resuscitation, reanimation, sane form, jumping up? Now, that kind of illustration was used by the rabbis a number of times. I can find myself a number of such passages. In Babylonian Sanhedrin, which is a Gemara 90b, there is the discussion here where it is said that Queen Cleopatra asked Rabbi Meir, but I somewhat doubt that Queen Cleopatra is asking for advice from Rabbi Meir, but nonetheless, we will not get into that discussion. The question that is posed here, and the answer is what's important, and asked the question whether the dead rise naked or clothed. And Rabbi Meir reported, thou mayest deduce from a wheat grain, if a grain of wheat which is buried naked sprouteth forth in many robes, how much more so the righteous who are buried in their raiment? And that sounds very much like Paul here, though not quite the same context. Or again in the sayings, or Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer, the sayings of Rabbi Eliezer, Eleazar attempts to prove with the aid of this seed analogy the same line of reasoning, that the dead do not rise naked as a grain of wheat, but they rise with all the abundance the grain of wheat produces, and thus rise clothed. W.D. Davies has used these two examples, there are many others, to argue that the analogy of the grain of wheat used by Paul was thus probably a rabbinic commonplace. And I don't doubt that. Paul is not trying to invent illustrations. Illustrations are like tennis balls, and the one who places it best wins the point. So he is using an illustration that is fairly common. But his point here is that how foolish to say, do they just pop up as they were before? No, not at all. There is some form that is given, but it's not just the same. Or again, he uses the analogy of creation, which is a very important analogy. And so he says, all flesh is not the same. And he uses a play between sarx and soma, two words for body or flesh. And while many do a lot of play on here, I like to say he's using them fairly synonymously all the way through. And he is saying that there are many kinds of forms that are given. And God is the kind of a God who can create all sorts of forms. He can create forms of one flesh, animals and birds and fish, and forms of heavenly bodies and of earthly bodies, and of stars, and stars differ from stars. He's talking purely phenomenally here. Paul is, we said last night, not a philosopher who's going to get into their philosophies and debate that. He's going to counter those with the gospel. And when he talks naturally here, I'm sure we could debate on all sorts of matters, astronomically or agriculturally or whatever. All Paul is trying to say is that God is the God who, in creation, however it has come about, clothes his created beings with proper forms. And there is a great variety. So if you get stuck on the question, are we going to pop up just as we are, you're giving God no freedom at all. You're assuming that things just pop up only in the way you can conceive of them. God is the kind of God who does all sorts of things. So with the plant imagery, the seed is planted. The plant that grows differs from the seed in form and appearance. It's not just the seed popping up. God determines the form. The implication is that it'll be a much more better form, a much more glorious form than that which was planted, as in seed. And yet the implication always is that there's some kind of continuity between seed and stalk, between what God does in giving bodies, some kind of continuity. Farmers, I take it, though I'm not a farmer, but I think it's obvious they have full expectation of what they're going to get as a harvest. They don't just plant and say, I hope, I hope, I hope. They have full expectation. So Paul uses these two analogies. Then Paul begins to explicate his thought on the basis of these two analogies. And so in verse 42 he says, so it will be with the resurrection of the dead. Let me now spell out the implications. I'd like to just make some 5 points here that I think he makes, either directly or implied. First of all, it's a changed body, a transformed body. As with seed, it's changed. And he says that quite directly in verses 42 through 44, and then in 51 and 52. The body that is sown is perishable, but it's raised imperishable, or corruptible and raised incorruptible. It is sown in dishonor, it is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness, it is raised in power. It is sown a natural body, it is raised a spiritual body. I don't think I want to go through and break all of those 4 down and make great sharp distinctions. I think he's trying to, as it were, lay it on, various ways of expressing it, so we get the point that there's change that goes on. And he says again in verses 51 and 52, listen, I tell you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed, transformed, in a flash, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trump, for the trumpet will sound, the dead will be raised, incorruptible, imperishable, and we shall be changed. Not resuscitated, not reanimated, but transformed and recreated. Jesus perhaps had something in mind like this, though didn't express it that fully, when he said to the Sadducees, the resurrection is something like the angels in heaven. There's some change in your thinking has to go on. So they'll be changed. They'll be changed. Secondly, by the implication here is that this transformed, changed, recreated body, recreated personal totality, using body in that sense, is in continuity with that which preceded, so that that which grows as stalk and flower and all is in continuity with that which is planted. We shall be the same people transformed, not differing persons entirely when we're raised from the dead, but rather this will be the culmination of the whole redemptive process. As we talked last night about process from first fruits, aparche, to coming or presence, parousia, to end, telos, and that we have to think in terms of processes God is dealing with us. The culmination for us will be, as Romans 8, we quoted, says, when we receive the adoption of sons, when we receive the new physical properties, and they will be in continuity with what we are. So as you grow in maturity, indeed in adulthood, you're quite different than you were as a child. At least autobiographically I am, I think. And yet there certainly is continuity there. And those who have watched that continuity can somewhat trace it. Some of us, in our pride, want to disown it, but nonetheless, there is that continuity there. And as parents, we watch that continuity blossom and grow and move on, and yet recognize that in adulthood they go on to become those no longer under our hothouse care, but those who are our equals and fellows, and we have such relationships. But it is in continuity. What Paul also wants to say, and I would like to stress thirdly, is that it is a body given by God. As with Christ's own resurrection, in God raised him up, so in this it is a body given by God. It is not something that we bring about. In fact, Paul has said in chapter 15, verse 50, flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God. The little expression, sarx kai haima, flesh and blood, has been a hotbed of discussion down through the ages, you might know. The Corinthians might have used it as their watchword. Flesh and blood cannot inherit, and Paul now is acknowledging that, perhaps. Certainly the Gnostics in the early church used it to deny a physical resurrection. For they said, Paul said, flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God. Thus, it can't be physical in any way. And you might know that in modern theology, many use this passage also to say resurrection has to be only spiritual. It can in no way be, in any sense, physical, because flesh and blood cannot inherit the things of the kingdom of God. On the other hand, flesh and blood is an idiom. And you have to judge idioms in terms of how they are used. You have to not just take things out and do etymology on them or treat them individually, but you have to take them in usage. If I can give an example, which was an example used by another quite frequently, when you say the word automobile, what do you think of? Well, you probably think of car. But automobile, etymologically, is anything that is automobile. So you could very well have thought of anything other than horse-driven, or pulled or pushed. You could have thought of train. You could have thought of aeroplane. You could have thought of garbage truck. You could have thought of taxi. You probably didn't think of any of those things, because you wouldn't have called probably, maybe taxi, but hardly, any of those things an automobile. So we use words in context. Idioms, of course, when you dissect, one of the hardest things to learn any language is to learn the idioms. Because if you be literal, you come out to very ridiculous things. So I would suggest that here you have some idiomatic expression. For instance, Jesus in Matthew chapter 16, verse 17, talking to Peter in the Great Confession, says to him, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed that to you, but my Father who is in heaven." He didn't mean just material things did not reveal that to you, but he meant a person or mankind in his finitude, apart from revelation. Man in his finitude did not reveal that to you. Or Paul in Galatians chapter 1, verse 16 says, as he's talking about his conversion, he says, after his conversion, I did not confer with flesh and blood, but I went into Arabia. He didn't have any idea if I did not confer with material flesh or something like that. He's not a Buddhist looking at decayed flesh. He just said, I didn't confer with anybody, any person, any one finite person, but rather I went into Arabia and there studied and learned, was taught by God. I would suggest that what we're talking about here is, what Paul is saying here is that man in his finitude cannot inherit the kingdom of God. It must be God who embodies and gives a body and gives form to resurrection. It will not be man in his finitude. Furthermore, may I suggest, fourthly, it's called a body that is a spiritual body. Now, Paul recognizes that when he says this kind of thing, he's getting into something that sounds very Grecian, and he makes quite a clear statement so that nobody misunderstands. He says in verse 46, what I mean here is that the spiritual did not come first, as though Platonic, the spiritual, and then the material is the reflection, but the soul, the bodily came first, the natural came first, and after that then the spiritual. The first man that I'm talking about was of the dust of the earth. The second man was from heaven. In Greek thought, you have the heavenly prototype, the spiritual, of which the physical is a reflection. The first man is heavenly. The second man is earthly. Paul says, I'm not talking that way. I don't want you to confuse this with Greek mentality. I'm talking about the first man being natural historically. I'm talking on the historical plane. And the second man is the one who is from heaven. He just reverses the whole usual understanding of man. He does that to a Gentile audience who evidently is heavily saturated in Greek philosophy. But nonetheless, he says, but it is to be, it is sown a natural body, it is sown a sukikos, if you're a Greek, body. It is raised a spiritual body, a pneumatikos body. A sukikos is one who is guided by all of the worldly principles, all the creation, is a person rightly, fully human, but is not thinking spiritual. You remember in 1 Corinthians earlier, chapter 3 particularly, Paul can talk about, in chapter 2 earlier, he can talk about the sukikos man, we translate in the King James natural man, does not receive the things of the kingdom of God. You need to be rather pneumatikos. You need to be spiritual. But then he goes on to say, but as Christians, you can still be sarkos, fleshly Christians. But you ought to be pneumatikos, spiritual. But the sukakos person in 1 Corinthians 2 and 3 is the person guided only by creation principles, by fleshly principles, by worldly principles, dominated in that way. And I think he's using those adjectives in the same way. In fact, Murray Harris, in his book Raised Immortal, has quite a study on the adjectives here, arguing the akos adjectives are talking about a quality of life, a characterization of how they are guided and how they are worked out. And thus he is saying, it is sown a person who is animated and guided only by that which is of the world. But it is raised a person guided and animated by the Spirit. He's not talking about the substance, but he's talking more ethically here in adjectives, and thus so directed. So I suggest to you that the person in his totality here is described as not substance, but a totality that was formerly guided and motivated by only worldly features, now is guided and motivated by spiritual features. That's what the resurrection person is going to be like. Animated, energized, directed by the Spirit. And then furthermore, might I make the point, it is, as far as the resurrection, it is a resurrection that will bear the likeness of Christ's own resurrection. For in chapter 15, verse 49, just as we have borne the likeness of the earthly man, and he's already said that earthly man was the first natural man, Adam, so we shall bear the likeness of the man from heaven. And there Paul, I think, gives us his little key, how he is understanding the resurrection. He's working from the resurrection of Christ. Christ in his resurrection is raised and is touched and eats and has a resurrected body. In Luke's gospel, you remember, very interestingly, he presented himself before them and they could not believe for joy. And then he said, do you have anything to eat? And he ate before them. And that seemed to convince them. I don't know how that would have convinced you or me, but in Jewish theology, apparitions and angels don't have digestive tracts. The way to tell an apparition or an angel from the real person is whether they can eat. Now, I know that you'll go back, and the Jewish world does, and say, well, the angels who met with Abraham at the Oaks of Mamre ate with him. And the Jewish world is not always that closely logically knit, and they say, well, that's the exception. So you have an exception. We'll leave that. But all angels can't eat. If you read the story of Tobit and Tobias and the journey, and the angel who guided them and so on did marvelous things. As they got back, the angel had always said that he was a near kinsman, but when he got back, he said, oh no, I've been really lying all the time. I'm really the angel. And they couldn't believe, and he said, well, did you ever see me eat with you while we were on the journey? And Tobias said, no, as a matter of fact, I don't remember you eating. And he said, well, there you are. There's the evidence. Just as Jesus was a real person with a real physical makeup, and yet was one who came into the room without them noticing while the doors were closed, and one who was sent to his Father, one who in his full mortality was subject to all sorts of things of mortals are, but in his resurrection was guided by an entirely different, entirely different spiritual principles. So in our resurrection, we are to be in the likeness of Christ's resurrection. Paul thus concludes here, listen now, or behold. And that little word idu in Greek all times is something like the Hebrew hen that says, take note of this. Look at this. Here's something important. Behold, I show you or tell you a mystery. Not a secret, something esoteric, as in the Greek world. Not a riddle to be worked out in some way, as in the Greek world. But an enigma, as in the Hebrew world. Something that was known, and as you look back on it from a revelational perspective, can be understood more fully. A mysterion. Raymond Brown's great work on mystery in the New Testament is arguing that. I show you a mystery. So there are some 30 occurrences in the Aramaic Daniel of Raz and Pesher, mystery and interpretation. So at Qumran, Raz, mystery, and Pesher, interpretation. So Paul, in his some 19 or 20 occurrences, oftentimes uses it in this way, not always, but oftentimes, something that is now to be clarified. I want to tell you a mystery. You have gone through all of this debate in your understanding between Greek and Jewish worlds. You have within your own Second Temple Judaism, and I'm paraphrasing Jesus here, expanding a bit, had very diverse understandings of what death and resurrection is all about. You've always known that there's some kind of a contact that will continue, for when God makes covenant with his people, that contact and that covenant remains and death cannot break it. But how to understand that? Now, with more attention being given to the individual as we are in our thinking, in Greek ideology flooding in, now with trying to understand all the whys and the wherefores in the situation, Paul says, I have the key to it all. I see it. We'll be in the likeness of the man from heaven. We can work from his resurrection and can understand. I show you a mystery. We'll not all sleep in death, but we shall be changed. And then he emphasizes again, we shall be changed. What kind of a change, a transformation with recreated physical parts and all, in continuity with all that has preceded, so it will be the same persons. That which is enacted by God, for it is God who creates and recreates, animated, energized, directed by the Spirit fully in the very pattern and the paradigm that Jesus set and was set in Jesus' resurrection. It'll be at his coming, and I'd like to spend more time on his coming next time, but it'll be at his coming. So the Christian in our day, of a day of science and scientism and nature and naturalism and humanism, so the Christian does say, well, I realize that the questions are asked, how? And the questions sound very convincing, impossible. But Paul says, but there is one whom God did raise from the dead and set the pattern and the paradigm. And so the earnest Christian is called upon to believe that that pattern and paradigm has been set by our Christ, to base himself or herself on God's promise of continued relation, on God's working in Jesus, in raising him from the dead, and always recognizing that it is not of ourselves, flesh and blood, or of that which is purely human is going to bring it about, a sukkakos man, but it is that which God is going to bring about. And I find that a great hope, a great consolation. I pray, God, that when I come to place of death, whether it be tragically in accident or normally in old age or however else that I can't conceive, that not only will this be theory in my mind, I don't need it as substance for me right now. God, I pray God he'll give it to me at the time I need it. I don't ask him for to carry all the armaments that I'll ever need for everything I'll ever do. I pray only that he'll bring all of this to reflection and to understanding and to hope and to confidence, for it is God who is both creator and who is recreator, and we rest in that confidence. I thank you.